First of all, I'd like to thank Interacoustics Brazil for inviting me to talk to you today. And thanks to all of you for joining me here at this online Interacoustics event. I've been passionate about neonatal hearing screening for over 35 years, and therefore it's a great pleasure for me to talk to the people who work daily in this field. I'd like to thank you for your contributions to this important work and hope that over the next hour I'll be able to show you some things that will be of interest to you. As the title suggests, today I'm going to cover the use of otoacoustic emissions specific to neonatal hearing screening, and at the end I'll touch on the topic of using otoacoustic emissions during follow-up and differential diagnosis. But before I begin, if you just permit me to briefly introduce myself. So originally I studied physics and medical physics, and then I did a 5-year clinical research post at the Institute of Laryngology and Otology. I was very lucky because I actually landed on my feet, and the very first job I had, I'd never heard of otoacoustic emissions in 1984, and I just happened to land in David Kemp's laboratory soon after he had discovered emissions, and a real privilege to have worked there. I then spent 25 years in industry on research and development activities, specifically on OE equipment design. And then just over 6 years ago, I joined the Demont Group, working on their OE and ABR products, obviously working closely with the Interacoustics team. So today's topics, a little more detail. In order to understand the relevance and limitations of using otoacoustic emissions to screen for normal hearing, I'd like to present an overview of what our understanding of emissions are and how we measure them. Then I'm going to talk about the evolution and technical challenges of otoacoustic emissions for neonatal screening. Then, like all types of screening tests, whether it's for COVID-19 or cancers, it's so important to monitor the performance of the screening test. And in reality, this is a huge and difficult topic as it depends on many factors, and I'll provide a brief overview of that. And then finally, I'll present a quick look at how otoacoustic emissions fit in to a more complete hearing diagnostic pathway. So let's kick off with what exactly are otoacoustic emissions. And I think what I'd like to do is to set them into the context of our understanding of the mechanism of hearing, and then we can see how we can actually use them. So Helmholtz, back in the 19th century, he is well known for his theory of resonance, and he demonstrated this phenomena with his selection of resonators. And they're basically more sophisticated versions of the bottles that we blew across as kids to make a tune. And it's this combination of elasticity of the compressible air along with the mass of the air in the bottle which determines the resonant frequency. So you have a mass and you have a springy element, which is the compressible air. Becquerel, in the middle of the last century, he observed that the size and the stiffness of the basilar membrane in the cochlea varied along its length. So this dimensional difference and the stiffness difference also leads to a different resonant frequency at each location, similar to Helmholtz's different-sized globes. Now, although this was an enormously valuable contribution to our understanding of the tuning of the cochlea, it was unable to explain the incredibly fine frequency resolution that we actually possess. So the next significant step was in 1977, when David Kemp, he was performing very detailed psychoacoustic measurements on his own ears. He was exploring in great detail the threshold of hearing in the areas where he could perceive distortions, etc., and typically using very low stimulus levels. And he mapped his ears out in great detail. And this is a chart from 20 years later from two other authors, but he observed in his own ears a kind of a microstructure to the hearing threshold. And this is a very detailed audiogram over a very small range of frequencies, and you can see that there's a repeating kind of waveform pattern to the threshold. Now, he has a background in signals and physics, and so he recognized straight away that this repeating, undulating pattern in the threshold was likely to be caused by the reflection of the sound inside the cochlea, interfering with the incoming stimulus. And he thought, well, if there's sound bouncing around inside the cochlea, perhaps some of it leaks back out of the cochlea, in which case, why not try and measure it in the ear canal? So this is a photograph of the graphs of David's very first otoacoustic emission measurements. And each line represents the response from the different intensities of the click stimuli he presented to his ears. And the left-hand side of the graph is very messy. That's the large stimulus that the algorithm has not managed to completely remove. But from about a third of the way across, those waveforms are the emissions that are actually coming out, and they originate from inside the cochlea. So let's step back a little and just reflect on what our auditory system can actually achieve, and see how otoacoustic emissions contribute to that. Our hearing has a very large dynamic range. Typically, we can distinguish sound intensity over a range of perhaps 120 decibels or more. And however, when we measure the information that the nerves are then transmitting to the brain, they have a firing rate that varies from perhaps 1 to around 100 hertz. So it's hard to imagine how the nerves can encode that full 120 decibels of sound range. So let's have a quick look at another organ that does some amazing things as well. And the eye faces very similar challenges. The dynamic range of vision from the faintest glimmer of light to the brightest light that we can tolerate is also around about 120 decibels of dynamic range. However, the eye has a mechanism for controlling the amount of light that arrives at the sensor cells at the back of the eye, in the retina, and it's called the pupil. And like the aperture of a camera, it regulates the amount of light arriving at the sensor so as to optimize the image intensity on the sensor cells. So let's have a little look at what is responsible for achieving that same phenomena in the cochlea. And we believe that the same process occurs there. So here is an electron microscope image of the basilar membrane, and it shows it's a perfectly healthy ear. It shows the 3 rows of outer hair cells, of which there are around 12,000 in total. And it shows a single row of the inner hair cells. And we know that the nerves from the inner hair cells take the information about the sound towards the brain. They therefore have an afferent nerve pathway. However, the outer hair cells are supplied with nerve signals that come from the brain. And this hints that much like the pupil of the eye, perhaps there is some kind of central control from the brain that is regulating the operation of the basilar membrane. And one way we can study the influence of these outer hair cells and what their control signals do is to examine how the cochlea performs once those cells are damaged. So if we now look at a basilar membrane that's been subjected to too much noise, typically the outer hair cells are the first to suffer the effects of loud sounds. And if we measure the hearing of people who have this kind of damage to their outer hair cells, then we can see that the following has happened, okay? So the first thing we observe is that the threshold of hearing worsens. So for the very quiet sounds, we can't hear them anymore. And then as we increase the intensity of the sound, that's our new threshold of hearing. and louder sounds are actually heard the same as if there wasn't anything wrong with our hearing. So we still have the same threshold of pain when the sound is too loud. Now, we call this recruitment, and it's a sign that the normal 120 decibel dynamic range of hearing has been reduced. To make matters worse, we also notice that the frequency discrimination deteriorates for these patients. The real-world impact of a reduced frequency discrimination or resolution of frequencies is a reduced ability to understand speech in noisy environments. So, in summary, we lose our ability to hear the quieter sounds. The loud sounds are still perceived as loud, the dynamic range has been reduced, and the discrimination worsens. And it's the loss of this non-linearity of the cochlea where it was able to detect sound over this huge range that has been lost. Now, we can use hearing aid amplification, which has compression to restore the full range, dynamic range of perception again. However, the frequency discrimination is hard to fix. And so we still suffer, even if we amplify correctly, we still suffer with being able to discriminate frequencies correctly. And if we look inside the cochlea, now there's been a lot of measurements, observations, and some very clever mathematical modeling theories that have evolved as to how the sound travels along the basilar membrane. And if the cochlea has normal outer hair cells, when a quiet sound is presented, the waves get the energy added by the hair cells to amplify the sound up to a sharp peak. This is what gives us that good threshold and our frequency discrimination. However, when the outer hair cells are damaged or missing, the sound is not amplified, it does not form a sharp peak at its characteristic place, and therefore we have a poorer threshold and a reduced ability to discriminate close frequencies. And it's the outer hair cells that were responsible for that behavior. So let's quickly summarize. Our understanding is that it is these hair cells on the basilar membrane, specifically the 3 rows of outer hair cells, that contribute significantly to an enhancement in our hearing, both in terms of threshold and the resolution. As the acoustic wave, travelling wave, passes along the basilar membrane, these outer hair cells impart some energy into the wave by employing micromechanical movements of the cells, and this energy provides signal amplification. Now, luckily, we're able to observe the presence of this energy that is added by the cochlea because a very, very small amount of it arrives back at the ear canal as acoustic energy. However, the challenge is what is the most reliable way to measure this energy, and finding solutions to that has kept me interested in this field for pretty much my entire working life. Now, unfortunately, as we age, our basilar membrane begins to look more like this due to the noise insults we've received over our lives. And many experiments have shown that as the outer hair cells diminish in number, the otoacoustic emission reduces and eventually disappears. Along with it goes our good hearing threshold and our ability to understand speech in noisy environments. Now, unfortunately, for various reasons, about 1 in 1,000 children are born with a cochlea that has a sensory neural impairment, which also reduces or stops normal outer hair cell function, and therefore the otoacoustic emission is absent. And this is why otoacoustic emissions provide us with a window, a good tool into the status of the hearing of infants. Now, I'm sure we're all aware that there's more than one type of otoacoustic emission, and I'd like to just briefly run through the different types, because actually it's quite confusing because there are so many acronyms that are used. And in reality, most of those types of emission are not really a different type of emission so much as a different way we've had to develop a testing method, a way of measuring that signal. So I'm going to title this section the phenotypes, just to look at the different classifications. Okay, so broadly we can classify them as either spontaneous or stimulated emissions, and some people do have a spontaneous emission that comes from it comes into their ear canal. We can measure it with a microphone. Clinically, this is not proven to be very interesting, to be honest. They're called spontaneous otoacoustic emissions. However, I'll only be discussing stimulated emissions because our probe is going to have a loudspeaker in it to provide a stimulus. So we'll be looking at the stimulated emissions are generated as a result of the energy input from the outer hair cells in response to a sound that's been presented to the cochlea. Now, David Kemp very succinctly summarized what otoacoustic emissions are. And the reason that we can measure the signal in the ear canal is complete luck, because there's no reason for that sound to come out. It's present in the cochlea for a purpose. We're very lucky that some of it happens to leak out, and we can measure it, and it then tells us very useful information about the cochlea. So there are three types of stimulated otoacoustic emission. The first of these is the stimulus frequency emission, called the SFOAE. Then there's the transient evoked, and finally the distortion product. Now, rather than try to explain the differences and similarities of these three types of emission from a cochlear mechanics standpoint, I propose to look at these classifications in relation to the evolution of the robust techniques that we've developed to measure this extremely small signal. So let's start with the stimulus signal going into the cochlea. Now, in this instance, we're going to put in a 2 kilohertz sine wave. That sine wave travels through the middle ear to the cochlea, where the outer hair cells increase the amplitude of that signal as it travels along the basilar membrane, and they add some energy to it. And that energy is at the same frequency, and some of it leaks back out. So when some of that energy escapes, we can measure it with the microphone in the probe. And this is what we measure. Now, the stimulus is still present because we're still playing the stimulus from the loudspeaker, and the emission is about 1,000 times smaller. So there's the problem. If we want to know whether the ear produced an emission or not, we have to be able to tell whether the response is 1,000th bigger than what we put in. Now, this is very tricky to do reliably, and therefore it's not used routinely in the clinic. It is possible. It's a research tool, and some people do it, but it's not a practical clinical tool. So this type of emission is a stimulus frequency emission because the response comes back at the same frequency as the stimulus. It's a little bit misleading because in some ways a transient emission is also a stimulus frequency emission, but we'll come on to that shortly. Now, fortunately, a non-intuitive property of the travelling wave in the cochlea is that it actually travels very slowly. So normally sound will travel about 30 centimeters per millisecond. Now, in the cochlea, after 1 millisecond, the travelling wave has barely started its journey to the apex. This slow travel time means that we can interrupt our stimulus and listen in the gap to see whether the very small response has come back. So this is a diagram actually that explains how ultrasound works, because an ultrasound scanner has exactly the same issue. They're looking for a very faint reflection coming back from the boundaries between the organs in our body, and they need a large stimulus to do that. And so they need to put a pulse of energy in and then listen in the gaps. And that's exactly what we do with otoacoustic emissions. So let's have a look at the application to our ear. Now, I'm going to reduce the cross-sectional diagram to a rather simple triangle. And here's our loudspeaker that's going to play the sound and the microphone that's going to record in the ear canal. And here goes our short stimulus. So we're putting a stimulus in, and then we're waiting a while, and then we're putting another stimulus in. And you can see that as that pulse travels from the base of the cochlea to the apex, the shape changes. And that's because a pulse is a broadband stimulus that contains all the frequencies, and the cochlea is tuned to high frequencies at its base and low frequencies at the apex, and it absorbs the energy depending on the frequency of the place of the cochlea. So the very sharp shape at the beginning, containing the high frequencies, begins to get flattened and rounded as the high frequencies are slowly eliminated from the stimulus as it travels along the membrane. Because at the characteristic place in the cochlea, the sound of that frequency cannot travel beyond it. Okay? So the outer hair cells, as that pulse is traveling along the basilar membrane, are adding energy, and they're adding energy at the frequency of their characteristic place. So let's see what the emission that's being generated, the energy that's being generated by the outer hair cells looks like. And you can see that it's adding high frequencies at the base, low frequencies at the apex. And then that waveform exits the cochlea, travels back through the middle ear, and we measure it with the microphone. Now, in reality, the waveform doesn't wait in the cochlea until the pulse has got to the end. So the reality, it looks a little bit more like this. The waveform starts to be emitted, that we start measuring it while the pulse is still traveling. And this tells us kind of roughly how long we need to wait before we can send the next pulse in. So now this is a real one, and we have removed the stimulus from the beginning because there's always a little bit of stimulus residue left because the stimulus is 1,000 times or more louder than the response. So we blank that off, and then we can see that the high frequencies are present at the beginning because they've come from the base, and the low frequencies took longer to travel, and so 10 milliseconds or so later they start to appear in our response. Now, because we put a stimulus in that was broadband, it contained all the frequencies, and that all the frequencies came back out, it is in fact a stimulus frequency emission. It's just we call it a transient emission because we had to interrupt the stimuli in order to record it. So the last type of emission is a distortion product emission. And just before I go on to the discussion about the emissions, I would like to just introduce my kind of understanding of distortion, because I think we need to look at it in a slightly different way to understand how the emissions are generated. So we are very used to looking at waveforms, and the waveform is a time axis in the horizontal and a pressure axis in the vertical, and that's a standard sine wave with 5 cycles. And there's another way of looking at acoustic energy, and that's to look at it in the frequency domain. And so now we have another chart with frequency along the horizontal axis and amplitude or energy on the vertical axis. Now the red bar in that graph represents exactly the same information as the blue waveform, okay, because you can see that the frequency there is 5, which is the number of waves, and the size of the bar represents the amplitude of the waveform. Now, if we were to distort that sine wave a little bit, for example, if the loudspeaker that was producing it was not perfect, and we ended up with a graph like the wave that is now shown in green, you can see that the end of each sine wave is a little bit flat. At the characteristic place in the cochlea where we would be tuned to that frequency, we would not be able to tell that the waveform was a little bit flat. but we would clearly be able to hear that it was distorted. And to understand why we can hear that distortion, we need to look at the frequency chart. So if I now draw at the bottom what the frequency chart of that waveform looks like, it looks like that. And so actually what our ear hears when it is hearing the distortion is the presence of other frequencies. And so distortion is a way of taking energy at one frequency and placing it at other frequencies. You've smeared the energy across different frequencies. And that smearing of the sound is what makes listening to music in a distorted speaker so unpleasant and so difficult to hear the details in the music. And that process of taking energy from one frequency and placing it somewhere else through distortion is actually exactly what happens inside the ear, because the ear, like all acoustic systems, has its imperfections. And the imperfection that exists means that if we place two tones in the ear, we can generate a tone that was never present in the stimulus. And that's our distortion product. So here's measurements from a real ear. We have the same shape graph, frequency graph, with frequency along the bottom, energy up the side, and this is a measurement from my ear. And I've placed two tones into the ear, represented by the green lines. There's the first frequency and the second frequency, and that isn't the exact result from my ear because I've hidden some of the detail, and this is actually what was recorded. So the blue lines are lines that you were not present in the stimulus but have been created because this basilar membrane process has distorted the energy that I've put in the stimulus. Now, that's very useful from a measurement point of view, because now I haven't got to try and find a small amount of energy at the same frequency as the stimulus. I can just go and look for a frequency that was never present in the stimulus. And they're all mathematically related to the frequencies of the stimuli, and those are the formulae. And we clinically, the most robust signal is this one, the 2F1 minus F2. And when we perform a DP measurement, actually we repeat these measurements at different frequencies multiple times, and then we represent it in a chart like that, where each of the red spots there is the level of the DP from the measurements. Having a quick look at what happens inside the cochlea when this is happening. And so once again, I've taken a diagrammatic view of the basilar membrane with the energy flows, but I'm going to represent that now just as a simple graph with the base on the left, the apex on the right, and here is one of the tones of the stimuli going along the basilar membrane. The outer hair cells are adding energy, building that wave to a crescendo at its characteristic place. In this case, it's F2, and you can see that after the characteristic place, there is no propagation of sound in an apical direction. If we introduce the second tone, same thing happens, but now it's further up towards the apex because it's a lower frequency tone. And what we measure is something that's generated, a distortion that's generated where both of those tones are present, that comes out at a different frequency. So some magic is happening at around this point where both of those tones are present. And that is the DP that then comes back down towards the base, and that's what we measure in the ear. Now, we know that it takes two tones to produce that distortion product, so we know that the area in the membrane that's producing that distortion has to be where both tones are present, and we can look at what the amplitude, the combined amplitude of the two tones is, and that's now shown in red. And you can see that the area with the greatest amount of both tones present is very, very close to the peak of F2. So from that, we can deduce that the site of the DP generation was actually at the F2 place. And this can be a little confusing because when we measure a DP at 2 kilohertz, what we actually mean is that the F2 was at 2 kilohertz. The DP frequency itself is probably around 1.2 kilohertz. So what we measure in the ear canal is 1.2 kilohertz, but it came from the site on the basilar membrane that was characteristic of the 2 kilohertz tone. And in fact, because of the shape of the travelling wave, we actually want to equalize the energy of F1 and F2 at the site of location, at the site of generation. And to do that, we actually have a larger F1 than F2 because F1 is still being amplified as it passes the F2 place. So that's why most protocols that are testing DPs will have a lower level, intensity level for F2. And that's the graph there. So the DP generator. So I'd like to just summarize then the different phenotypes briefly. So we had stimulus frequency emissions. They're the largest emissions of all, but they're most technically difficult to measure, and so we don't do them in the clinic. And then we put in a stimulus and got a frequency emission back out at the same frequency, but we had to listen to it in the silences. And so that's a transient evoked otoacoustic emission, and we normally use a broadband stimulus for that. And then finally, the other way to reliably observe emissions is to generate it at a frequency that wasn't present in the stimuli, and that's what a distortion product otoacoustic emission is. So the clinical focus is always on DPs and TEs because they give us that more robust measurement method. So we must remember that actually the TEs are frequency specific, even if we are using a broadband stimulus. And I guess although I've argued that they're essentially the same thing, we're just measuring them in different ways, because of the different techniques of measuring them, there are advantages and disadvantages to each type. And the transient, the TE emission, is better at low frequency measurements. And because we're limiting the amount of energy we're putting in the ear because there's big gaps in the sound, it typically the OAE is absent when the loss is greater than 30 decibels. Whereas with distortion products, we can measure up to higher frequencies, but it's not so easy to measure low frequencies because the DP comes out at half an octave lower than the characteristic than F2. But we are putting more energy into the ear because it's a continuous tone, and so you can see losses. You can measure it even if somebody has a loss approaching 40 decibels. We can reduce the stimulus size with DPs so that then you observe losses of, you don't get an emission if the loss is greater than 30 decibels. So it can be adjusted for the screening protocol that we want. So that ends the kind of phenotype section, and now let's move on to their role in screening. Okay. So, as I said, I was very lucky to get this job in David Kemp's laboratory, and it was in London. He focused on his research while I developed measurement methods and tested them on patients there. And this was at a time before the PC, and that was the size of the equipment that we had to use at the time, a large mini computer, and obviously there were no commercial probes, so we made our own very ugly probes. But that was in 1984, but within a year, the methods and equipment had evolved enough to be able to measure otoacoustic emissions from a baby, and I still have an incredibly strong memory from 35 years ago of testing the first neonate in the UK and watching the large response waveform appear in front of me. And the parents were rightly concerned because there was a significant history of hearing impairment in their family. And in less than a minute, it had been possible to reassure them that the cochlear function of their newborn appeared to be completely normal. Now, at this time, in the 1980s in the UK, hearing screening was performed at around 8 months of age using a behavioural test, which we informally called the distraction test. And it was performed by our health visitors, either at the local doctor's clinic or in the home. And despite the best efforts of those performing this test, the sensitivity of it was very poor. And only around 50% of the infants with a hearing loss were detected using this type of screening. And sadly, the average age of detection of a significant hearing loss was around 2.5 years. Now, unfortunately, such a late detection leads to a poorer speech and language outcome with a high cost to the individual and society. And it's well recognised that the advantages of early intervention, obviously. Now, Klaus Elberling is one of the giants of this field, and he's still actively researching for interacoustics at the age of 80. And in 1982, he'd beaten us to it, and he recorded otoacoustic emissions from some neonates, and he suggested that it could be an appropriate screening procedure. And it was his publication that I read at that time that strongly motivated us to make a robust method for measuring otoacoustic emissions in neonates. And it's so often the case that problems are solved when the appropriate technology becomes available. And David Kemp's discovery of the otoacoustic emission in 1977 was a very significant step in our understanding of how the cochlea functions. But a few years later, it was the availability of the IBM PC that enabled us to build equipment with sufficient processing power to reliably measure these emissions. Furthermore, they were affordable, so that clinics could start to regularly test patients. So as this slide shows, it's this rapid progression of computing technology that's enabled us to produce ever more practical and cost-effective clinical instrumentation. Now, the first commercially available device, the ILO 88, arrived on the market in 1988, and as this slide shows, after a few pioneering sites started newborn screening, there was a rapid increase in the USA once the government bodies produced recommendations, regulations, and insurance reimbursement codes. And as in other countries, it seems to take about 10 years to transition from the initial pilot studies to near 100% screening coverage. Now I'd like to cover how we make the best measurements in a screening environment. And when we make ABR measurements, we know that we must ensure that the electrical interference is as small as possible. So practically this means we give attention to the type of lighting in the room and not having the test room next to the X-ray department, for example. Also, we try to reduce the electrode impedance as much as we can so that the ABR signal is as clean as possible. Now, it's equally important when performing otoacoustic emissions that we obtain the best signal that we can from the patient. In this case, we're more concerned with acoustic noise, but we need a test location that has low environmental noise. Things that cause problems are nearby traffic noise, conversations down the corridor, air conditioning units, etc. So firstly, pay careful attention to where the testing is going to be performed. And then secondly, fit the probe really well into the ear, because this attenuates the environmental noise. So having got the noise outside the ear canal as good as possible, in the next few slides, I'd like to take a quick look at some of the causes of noise in our measurement and how much of an impact these noises have on the test time. So first of all, a very brief discussion about the basic principle of noise reduction. In signal processing, we use averaging. So averaging functions when we have a signal that can be the same each time we trigger it. So in the case of otoacoustic emissions, whether it's a TE or a DP, we repeatedly apply an identical stimulus, which triggers an identical response from the cochlea. However, noise is always present in each of the single measurements and is hopefully very random. So when it's random, we know that if we add two measurements together, the signal grows to twice the size, but the noise only grows to 1.4 times the size. So this fundamental rule of physics means that each time we double the number of averages in our result, we improve the signal-to-noise ratio by 3 decibels. So using this physical rule of averaging, I've written a little application which allows us to determine or estimate the test time for any given level of signal and noise. So we can set the required signal-to-noise ratio, the level of the signal that we're measuring, the noise level that's present in the measurement, and how many clicks per second we're using. And that will tell us how long the test takes. So here's a graph showing the signal level and the noise level, and along the horizontal axis there we've got the size of the signal in decibels, SPL, and the signal there I've selected is 15 decibels. That's a typical transient emission size from a neonate in a good recording. So that would be a typical size. And now here's the noise in that measurement. Now that's 25 decibels, and that is the absolute minimum noise we can ever get in a measurement. And that's because that noise is the thermal noise in the microphone. It's the background noise of the equipment, basically. So that's a theoretical minimum test time if there was no noise coming at all from the environment or the patient. So we can plug those figures into our little simulator, and it tells us that we need 161 clicks, which takes 2.2 seconds. So that's a theoretical minimum which we could never achieve in a real patient. So let's have a look now at a real patient. This is a well-behaved patient who's just quietly breathing in a very calm manner. And they have a noise level of around 30 decibels, SPL, measured in the ear canal. So again, if we use those numbers, we'll find that that takes 7.1 seconds. Okay, so that's the realistic minimum test time that can be achieved with a neonate with a decent size otoacoustic emission breathing calmly. So let's have a look at what the effect of more realistic noises are. So what are the sources of noises? What levels are they typically? And what can we do about them to make them less? Okay, so this source of noise I'm going to first introduce. My dad taught me about when I was about 5 years old, and it's the transmission of sound along a cable. And we did it with yogurt pots, like these girls, and I was delighted as delighted as they were to learn about it. Now, I spent some time with a probe in my ear, measuring the sound level in the ear canal, at the same time as gently rubbing the cable from the probe to the instrument. And typically that would be caused by the cable rubbing against clothing when you're breathing, or just general movement of the body or the cable against the crib or the person holding the equipment, for example. So let's have a quick look. Typically I found that introduced around 35 decibels of noise. So again, plugging that into the simulator tells us that the test would now take 22 seconds. Okay, so at a practical level, a lot of this noise can be avoided if we place the cable carefully during the test. For example, if the baby's in a crib, support the cable and clamp it tight over the edge of the crib with your hand so that the breathing movements of the baby don't rub the cable. Or with an adult test, just holding the cable away from the patient's body can help. And you can explore this a little yourselves. Put a probe in your own ear and experiment with how much impact it has with you just rubbing the cable, and how to reduce that noise. And the new products we work on, we're always trying to reduce the friction on the cable casings to reduce the amount of noise that's propagated. But it is a significant issue. And the last one of these noise issues is if the probe is not able to achieve a good, secure fit in the ear canal. I have seen so many people holding the probe in place. Now, this introduces a lot of low-frequency noise into the measurement. And again, I ran some tests on my own ear, just holding the probe and seeing what the noise level was. And I found that I could have 38 decibels of noise in my ear just from holding the probe. Again, looking at the test time related to that, the test is now 45 seconds. So, in conclusion, with the same size of otoacoustic emission, we've gone from a typical best-case scenario with a well-fitted probe and controlled noise of a test that lasted 6 or 7 seconds, all the way up to 45 seconds, just simply by not paying attention to those issues. So the next section, we've done the history, we've done how to make good measurements. Now I'd like to talk about the performance of screening, because it's a very broad topic that shares many terms and analytical techniques with other fields of screening, whether that be COVID-19 testing or airport security. We use the same kind of terms. And in the early days of otoacoustic emission measurements, we relied on individual audiologists to look at the response waveform and decide whether the cochlea had produced an emission or not. Now, clearly, this approach is not appropriate for universal screening, and so instruments began to include automatic decision-making to decide whether the response was present or absent. Now, to give some perspective to the size of this task, I spent the first half of my career researching better ways to find the otoacoustic emission signal. And I've spent the second half trying to make sure that the instruments don't accidentally indicate that they found an emission when in fact it was absent or just noise. And so we've shifted the responsibility from the audiologist to the instrument to make the decision, and ultimately to the manufacturer. And so the manufacturers have to test in every conceivable way whether their devices make the right decision. And in screening, we have various terms to describe performance, and the two most common ones are sensitivity and specificity. In simple terms, sensitivity is how good the instrument is at finding hearing impairment, and specificity is how good the instrument is at finding normal hearing. One of the factors that makes understanding these numbers somewhat non-intuitive is the fact that the incidence of the impairment we are searching for is very low. Typically 1 in 1,000 neonates have a level of sensory neural hearing loss that we are screening for. So ideally, we would like an instrument that was 100% sensitive, 100% specific. But many instruments achieve of over 99% sensitivity and a specificity of more like 95%. But let's explore this a little further. Sensitivity is almost always a factor that is determined by the instrumentation. It's a measure of how good the instrument is at not mistaking noise for an emission. Specificity is partly determined by the instrument, but it's also largely determined by the test environment, how noisy it is, how good the screener is at fitting the probe, etc. The problem is that the costs associated with each of these performance parameters is very different. If the specificity is too low, lots of neonates are referred to follow-up. Now, this costs money, Each follow-up costs at least 10 times more than the screening test. And also there's a cost to the parents in terms of having to return to the test facility, but also a raised level of anxiety until they find out that their infant is actually not suffering a hearing impairment at all. On the other hand, if the sensitivity is too low, then neonates with hearing impairment will not be detected. And here, the large cost is difficult to quantify. The parents have been wrongly reassured and so do not make behavioural adjustments when communicating with their child. The enormous benefits of early amplification are missed, and there's a serious risk of lifetime impacts for that infant. Just to illustrate this a little further, it's a fairly standard to report screening performance using a type of chart or a table called a confusion matrix. It basically reports the number of test outcomes correctly or mistakenly identified. Strictly speaking, the positive outcome of screening test is when we find the condition we're looking for. In the case of screening for hearing impairment, it is therefore a positive test when we find hearing impairment. However, we like to think of a pass result as an infant that has a normal cochlear function. So it's easy to confuse the positives and the negatives, actually. Now, I've illustrated this particular confusion matrix with another type of screening, which also thinks of positive and negative outcomes in a similar way. So when we go to the airport to fly, we are screened in the security area. Now, they're searching for a positive case of a terrorist. However, we pass the screen if we are able to go through security without the alarm going off and having to be searched. So let's just examine the numbers in this trivial example and see that what the impact of sensitivity and specificity is, because I've chosen them to be similar to the typical hearing screening clinic. So we've got 10,000 people queuing up to go through airport security, and 1 in 1,000 of them are terrorists. Okay, so 999 of them are not. They're just like you and me. The screening test at the airport lets 19 out of 20 people through. Okay, so that's its specificity. And 1 in 20, the alarm goes off and they have to be checked. So if we look at the numbers that go through without any difficulty, of all the people that aren't terrorists, 9,499 of the 10,000 pass straight through without any problems at all. They're happy. All they have to do is put their shoes back on at the end. However, because 1 in 20 times the alarm goes off, 491 of those people have the anxiety of being checked further. So they have to go off into the little side room and they get the wand passed over them, checked for metal objects, and etc. And so it's very anxious, it's unpleasant. It costs a lot of money because they need a lot of staff at the airport to perform this. 9 times the alarm went off because there were genuine people carrying nasty metal objects or whatever. And those people have been trapped, and that's great. That's what we were trying to achieve. Those are the hearing impaired infants. However, one of them got through, and that's because the sensitivity of the test is not 100%. And so the cost of that one person getting through is extremely high. And so the numbers that fall out then tell us that the sensitivity was 90%, the specificity was 95%, and the positive predictive value tells you how many people you've inconvenienced in order to find your 9 genuine terrorists. As a manufacturer, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we deliver equipment with sensitivity that's very high. And for that, let me introduce you to Tim, the test head. And so Tim allows us to replicate, behave like an infant that does not have an emission, so it has a hearing impairment. And inside Tim's head there are various noise recordings from real clinics so that we can test over and over again with a real environment to check that our equipment performs as expected. And one of the benefits of TIM actually is that we include the ability to generate emissions, TEs and DPs, and even ABRs actually. So we can then plug our equipment in, plug in a PC, and we can run hundreds and hundreds of tests overnight, come back in the next morning and verify that the sensitivity of our instrument is as expected. And we do this after every software change, every protocol change, just to ensure that the equipment is functioning correctly. And so we come into work the next morning and the equipment has produced a report, a confusion matrix, indicating the number of tests that have been done, the number of tests that we expected to show hearing impairment. And in this case, we wanted to refer from the instrument for diagnostics in 370 cases, and we found 370 cases, which indicated our sensitivity is extremely high because we didn't miss any of them. And we also make an estimate of the specificity of the instrument, and we missed one emission. So we sent one person off to diagnostics that we would rather have not done. But that's still a very, very high level for the specificity. And as I said before, it's more determined by the clinic and the noise and the screeners. So we have to do this for every different protocol, because when you change the protocol, for example, you might decide you want a 3-band pass with 4 decibels or a 2-band pass with 6 decibels. We have to verify the performance of those protocols are meeting the expectations of the screening sensitivity. There's another factor, which is in the actual implementation in the clinic, you'll have a protocol not to do with the instrument, but to do with when you do the testing, how many times you do the testing. So, for example, a well baby protocol may be one OAE test, and then if that fails, you do a second one 6 hours later, and if you fail, then you do an ABR, for example. And perhaps the special care baby pathway is slightly different because there's a higher incidence of neurological issues. And each of those protocols affects the overall sensitivity of our screening. So we can deliver a piece of equipment that has a screening sensitivity of 99.7%, for example. But if you do multiple tests, then you're it's like rolling the dice multiple times. So you're affecting the statistics. So the main thing is to clearly define the test pathways that will be used. So, don't test within 1 hour of birth because the ears are wet. Make sure the protocol specifies 6 hours for the ears to dry, for example. And then one test, if the test fails, leave the baby 6 hours before the second test. And it's important to define those pathways to get consistent results, and then to monitor that they're being performed as we think. So just a very quick word, I'm running out of time, but a very quick word just on the follow-up OEs and how they can provide some diagnostic, differential diagnostic information. Now, just silly picture, but I do a little volunteering job in the evenings, repairing equipment for people to save it going into the waste. And so people bring along their hoovers and vacuum cleaners, etc. And because it's easy to start with the most obvious things, I always do that. So the first thing, we check the plug, and then we check the lead, and then we check the fuse, and then we check the switch. So before we start taking the device apart and trying to diagnose problems with the motor, we start at the outside with the easiest things. And we have to do the same thing with the ear. So have a look in the ear canal, obviously. Is there still debris in there? And then we're looking to see whether the middle ear conduction pathways are as normal. So we would do that with tympanometry. There's no point doing an otoacoustic emission until we know that both of those things are okay, because the otoacoustic emission relies upon a transmission pathway in and back out of the cochlea. So then we do an otoacoustic emission. That tells us if it's okay, that tells us that the outer hair cells are functioning correctly. That's great. It doesn't tell us whether the patient can hear, but we're getting some way into knowing that now. But there could be a retrocochlear problem. And so for that, we would then need to test electrophysiologically. And so what exactly does a valid OE measurement tell us about the patient? Well, a strong response tells us that the outer hair cells have done their job. They've added energy to the signal, and it tells us that that part of the chain is working correctly. It doesn't tell us anything about the actual threshold, other than if everything else is working in the chain, then the threshold is probably within 30 decibels of normal. But that's it. We can't give us more information than that. It does also tell us that the middle ear was functioning normally, because we wouldn't be able to measure an OE without it. So I'll wrap up. Thanks so much for listening. And as I said earlier, I hope something in this presentation was of interest to you. And thanks very much for listening.